What claims are just not backed by the historical facts? There has never been a Viking helmet found that had a horn attached to it. I'm sick of curriculum materials teaching my fourth graders that the Spanish discovered Florida when they were looking for the Fountain of Youth. That lie was developed in the 1920s as a tourist gimmick. There's literally nothing in the historical record that supports it. Marilyn Monroe never said, "If you can't handle me at my worst, you don't deserve me at my best." There is literally no documented proof she ever said that. That ancient people thought the earth was flat. We have records from around 430 BC where Greek philosophers spoke of the earth being a sphere. In 240 BC the Greek astronomer Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the earth and was only about 2 out. The White Star Line saying the Titanic was unsinkable. It was actually a shipping magazine that first called the Olympic class unsinkable. In a similar note, the RMS Britannic being called gigantic. The name gigantic only appears once on an order for an anchor. Every other piece of documentation refers to the Britannic as the Britannic. Einstein being a low-level student, his grades were average to top tier of the class, and he was pretty damn good academically. Executioners, hangmen didn't wear hoods. People knew who they were. There are even several instances where the job gets passed from father to son like a family business. They were paid okay but also made side money from selling stuff used for the execution like bits of rope and fabric and stuff. There's a book called Lord High Executioner by Howard Engel that goes into the history of it, and it's fascinating. Vomitoria were passages designed to accommodate large crowds, not rooms for actual vomiting. Vomit comes from Latin for spew forth. Catherine the Great did not do that with a horse. The idea that medieval early modern people, especially peasants, were filthy, had poor hygiene and never left their villages. Medieval people cleaned themselves and their clothes fairly regularly. They even cleaned their teeth by chewing split twigs. Also, it was fairly common even for peasants to travel to pilgrimage sites on holy days periods. Well, for starters, the claim that Napoleon was short is just not backed by historical facts. The guy was average height for his time. It's like saying your 5 feet 8 inches friend is a giant because he hangs out with a bunch of kindergartners. That ancient humans were dumb. I heard recently that the reason Columbus had trouble finding funding for his voyages had nothing to do with the powers that be believing the earth was flat. In fact, it was pretty well accepted by that point that it was spherical. However, they believed it was much bigger than Columbus believed it was, and that there would be nothing but ocean for thousands of miles. They thought the journey would cost much more than he was trying to say. He was wrong, and the fact that he ran into the Americas was just luck for him. Witch burning were daily occurrences in the Middle Age. I blame Da Vinci Code. Never did Marie Antoinette say, "Let them eat cake." To be honest, history has demonized that poor child. She was married to a Morin, she was in a foreign country, and she had no idea what she was doing. Young Earth creationism is not the historically believed position of the early Christian Church or the ancient Church. It's a fairly recent theological position initially purported by Seventh-day Adventists, but quickly became popular with fundamentalists due to backlash over evolution becoming mainstream. Before that, most people saw the creation narrative in Genesis as a narrative myth and was not meant to be read as scientific fact. Abner Doubleday inventing baseball in Cooperstown, New York. That the pyramids were built by Jewish slaves. The Egyptians were good at record keeping, and none of their records say anything about slaves being used for the construction of the pyramids. Edison invented the light bulb. That MSG is bad for you. When I was a kid back in the early 90s, I remember that was a big thing my parents and friends' parents would talk about. That every woman in the Middle Ages married at 12 or 13 and started having babies immediately. And they did not love and mourn their children as much as we do. That people in the Middle Ages thought the earth was flat. The Armenian genocide did happen, no matter how much the Turks desperately claim that it absolutely did not. The Kurds were responsible, and the Armenians deserved it anyway. X200B. I wish I had something funny to go along with this. I don't. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion is a fraudulent document claiming to outline a Jewish conspiracy for world domination. Published in the early 20th century in Russia, it has been thoroughly discredited as a forgery. Investigations, including one by the Times in 1921, confirmed its falseness. The document is widely condemned as anti-Semitic propaganda, lacking any historical or factual basis. IDK where it came from, but the whole prima nocta shtick. I'm thinking it came from Braveheart, but there's probably something else that came before it. The Holocaust never happened. I am baffled how people can believe this. The claim Mormons make that the Book of Mormon is a historical record of a group of ancient white Hebrew people who lived on the pre-Columbian American continent and were cursed with brown skin for disobeying God and those other people who became the Native Americans. Yeah, right. That Native Americans are descended from the lost tribe of Israel. Calling the American Civil War the War of Northern Aggression. Bitch, you literally shot first. Edit. I'm from the South and I've never heard this. The fuck you haven't. Trickle-down economics. General Omar Bradley was stopped by MP during the Battle of the Bulge in WW2 due to them thinking he was a Nazi infiltrator. The irony was that he was stopped because he correctly identified the capital of Illinois as Springfield when the officer thought it was Chicago. That the American Civil War wasn't about slavery and was started by the Union. Both of these are wildly wrong, but various groups hold to them like an emotional support blanket so they can rationalize their chosen side lost. That knowledge and science in Western Europe were wiped out during the Dark Ages because of the Church. In fact, the medieval Church was one of the only places in Europe keeping knowledge alive, as monks transcribed and copied ancient sources. For example, everything the ancient Greeks knew about the science of sound and acoustics was transmitted down via church sources. Not saying the church hasn't done awful things. But the usual narrative about its function in the Middle Ages is completely opposite from reality. Heck, while we're at it, the so-called Dark Ages didn't really exist at all. The people in medieval times would empty pots of shit and piss right out their window. If you stop and think about it for like 2 seconds, this idea is so fucking bizarre that it is surprising it became such a popular myth. I remember clearly being told this as fact by my 4th grade history teacher. China does not own the South China Sea, no matter how badly it wants to believe it with its 9-dash line. The entire history of the Mormon Church. That shit is filled with inaccuracies and lies that somehow people still fall for and end up joining that cult of polygamist pedophiles. The medieval times weren't as horrible as many people make it out to be. First off, the majority of their torture devices weren't actually real and were made in later dates just as props. Like the iron pair that supposedly broke people's jaws, that wasn't real and they didn't even have the technology to make a legit one back then. Also, peasants got 150 days off a year. The church believed it was important to keep the people happy so they wouldn't start a revolution. So next time you're requesting days off, just remember, you get less days off than a medieval peasant. That there was massive fraud in the 2020 election. When you lose 60 times in a row in federal court and fail to produce any evidence, it's time to hang it up. Mormonism. Trickle-down economics. Blackbeard's privateer transport, Sovereign and Vengeance, was certainly not a tremendously immense vessel, however really a light and deft frigate. The Sovereign and Vengeance was truly flexibility and quick. Very much like the way in which Somalian privateers used dinghies against freight ships. One of the most notorious is that the French are bad at warfare. The cheese-eating surrender monkey stereotype. We have one recent example of the French getting caught off guard and completely unprepared: World War II. The majority of their military history sees them as one of the most substantial military powers on the continent, if not the most powerful. That Trump won. The Earth has only exists for a few thousand years. Obama and the 2008 recession, he wasn't president till 2009. Anything related to the Book of Mormon being a real history of any people, and not a fiction created out of whole cloth in the 1800s. That good always prevails. All of the Mormon